Welcome everyone to this new episode of the Privacy Rules, Privacy Espresso series, a series where we go through the most recent news about privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity all over the world with the experts of the Alliance of Privacy Rules and sometimes special guests. Today with me, I have Dimitri Phillips, counsel from the Chinese law firm DaHui. Dimitri is one of their experts on dispute resolution, compliance, and corporate and M&A practice group, and his advice spans on various industries, including TMT, where he's even considered one of the rising star by Legal 500. So I'm very pleased to have him with us today. And the reason why I invited Dimitri and DaHui Lawyers with us today is that there are some news that we wanted to share with you all in relation to the Chinese law on privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity in particular. So first of all, Dimitri, thanks a lot for being with us today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me and DaHui here.
And Dimitri, I would like to immediately start because, as you know, this format is very short. Before we go deeper into the topic of today, that is related to the fact that Chinese law has been somehow relaxed in respect on how it was before, I would like you to give us a little overview on what we are talking about, which is this specific law we are referring at, because we know that the framework in China is pretty complex in this regard.
That's right. Thank you again. As in other jurisdictions, there are multiple frameworks actually for various kinds of data in China, but the primary one issued recently, one affected by last month's relaxation of the regulations, is personal information. Secondarily, a type called important data, but we won't get into that so much today. Now, personal information, or PI, it consists of the kind of data that most of the audience will probably be somewhat familiar by now using that term. Also, the term personal data is used. It's names, date of birth, contact information, and so on. There's also sensitive personal information, SPI, and that consists of biometrics, medical data, financial accounts, location tracking, and the like. Now, naturally, PI and some kinds of SPI are the sorts of data that companies collect and process in the ordinary course. And international companies in particular need to transfer across borders generally, at least between affiliates, for example, between headquarters in one country and branches in various other countries. China, like the EU and many other jurisdictions, does regulate the collection and processing of PI. Of particular concern recently is the cross-border transfer of PI, for which there are two major requirements. One is known as the security assessment. And this is a kind of self-assessment that's done first by a company, produces a report, and then there's a submission to the Cybersecurity Administration of China, the CAC. And they need to approve all this information before the company can transfer PI and sometimes important data out of China. Of course, the security assessment does not apply to all kinds of transfers. There are certain circumstances, certain triggers. For example, a threshold amount of data that has been processed or that's intended to be transferred abroad. The second requirement, when the security assessment is not triggered, there is what's known as the standard contracts process. The transferor and the recipient of the data, they sign a data transfer agreement. That needs to be filed with the CAC authorities. And there is also another self-assessment, but much simpler, that also needs to be produced and filed. This is a much less onerous requirement than the security assessment, but it's not insignificant. And in practice, starting from late last year, this standard contracts was a requirement for essentially almost all companies that needed to transfer PI outside of China. There was an alternative known as PI protection certification, but in practice, that's hardly feasible at this stage. So to sum up, starting late last year, for international companies, most, if not all of them, who had to transfer data out of China, personal information, some other types, they needed to carry out either a security assessment or the standard contracts process, even for their basic data management like human resources, let alone dealings with international customers.
Perfect, Dimitri. Thanks a lot for this brief overview on what we are talking about. It was very clear that we are speaking specifically about cross-border data transfer. That is a big topic in particular when it concerns about international law under the privacy perspective in particular. And it's clear which have been the requirements that had some sort of modification. So my next question to you is, which was specifically this type of change to simplify the process? So how did the authorities in China decided to make it simpler?
Right, thank you. The main change for the regulatory measures from last month were to exempt certain kinds of transfers of PI from both the security assessment and the standard contracts requirement. Also, the PI protection certification, but that wasn't really an option anyways. So, for example, if a company now needs to transfer personal information of employees out of China for human resource management, it generally can do that without having to go through a security assessment or a standard contract. It can just transfer it out. Similarly, if a company needs to transfer certain PI out to conclude or perform a contract with the data subject of that PI, it can also just transfer that out without going through the regulatory procedures. In fact, now most companies can transfer PI of up to 100,000 data subjects for any reason without going through these regulatory procedures. Now, to be clear, there are certain other requirements for collecting and processing data. Obviously, well-known ones like getting the consent from data subjects, which aren't related to these regulatory processes. Those other requirements have not been effective, and they generally still apply. But to sum up, for certain kinds of situations of data transfer, in particular for personal information, the companies won't have to go through the security assessment or the standard contract at all anymore. And that's the main change.
Okay, and it's a pretty relevant one, I would say, because it simplifies things not little. In this regard, Dimitri, whenever we speak about transfer of data, we face like restriction and requirements by the authorities. So, in your perspective, which was the approach in China? Was it to ease more the restriction side of them or the requirement side of them?
Well, there are relatively few absolute restrictions for data transfer under Chinese law. So it was mainly reducing the requirements and in some cases eliminating the requirements. So those were the exemptions that I just mentioned. There are actually other exemptions. And for a full list of them, obviously our audience should go to the regulations and also to understand when security assessment or standard contract is still required. You should go to the regulations or, of course, visit DaHui's website and see our newsfeed for some helpful summaries and guides. But there were some other kinds of changes, some other easings. So, for example, there were certain thresholds for doing the security assessment that would trigger the security assessment. And, for example, previously, if a company wanted to transfer data out of China, personal information, let's stick with, it would need to look at how much is transferred since the beginning of the previous year. And if it transferred more than 100,000 data subjects PI, it would need to do a security assessment. Now, the measures from last month have increased that threshold from 100,000 to 1 million and also reduced the time period. So you don't need to look all the way back from last year, just from January of this year. Now, this is going to allow a lot more companies to transfer a lot more data out of China before they have to bother with the security assessment at all. And again, as a reminder, to sum up, if you fall within one of the exemptions, then you don't need to worry about how much data you're processing. You can process it and transfer it abroad if you fall under one of the exemptions without having to worry about the security assessment or the standard data contracts anymore.
Perfect. Considering how big is the market in China, I think this is a very big news and is relevant just to make sure that you fall within one of the exemptions in order to transfer data. So, of course, the advice is always to double check with experts as you are to make sure that everything is fine. But, of course, it sounds as a good news. In this regard, and this is probably my last question to you, Dimitri, the Chinese law started as a very complex law, so as a very structured law with many requirements that considered pretty demanding in the international framework. Now we are seeing that the approach has been changing a bit, relaxing the laws and opening more, to the opportunity of changing, exchanging and transferring data. So in your professional opinion, as someone that has been working on this since the very beginning, do you believe that this is a new direction taken by China, or we might face another change of approach in the future, so that we provide our listeners with a bit of preparation on which can be the future approach to those laws?
That is a tricky question. First of all, last month's regulatory measures also did signal some further likely easing. One example is in a clarification about important data, really signaling that, at least at this stage, it's less important than what might have been thought before. Another is that within free trade zones, there's a signal that there might be even more reduction of the requirements for cross-border data transfer. And we'll be watching those developments and how they play out. That said, there is always going to be regulation, and data regulation is a growing concern, not just for China, but for most, if not all, other countries. As you know, even the US very recently stepped up its cross-border data transfer regulation, especially in the last few months. Actually, it's interesting to note that this easing from last month in China was prefigured by a draft regulation early last fall, and many commentators expected it to be implemented before the end of last year. That was not the case. And then a month and a half ago, the US president issues the executive order, which some consider a game changer for US cross-border data transfer regulation. And then just 2-3 weeks after, we get this easing finally implemented from the Chinese side. Now, I won't comment on geopolitics, but one may wonder about the interplay of such regulation. And just as interesting, if not more interesting in the long run, is a somewhat related signal of easing from China. Just last week, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology announced the elimination of certain foreign investment restrictions in telecom sectors, including cloud services. This is big. In other words, for the first time, foreign parties can invest in and can engage in cloud services business within China and in some other telecom sectors that were of great interest for a long time, but that were partly or entirely off limits to foreign parties. And Alessandro, as you know, these are data-heavy industries. So these two relaxings from last month and last week dovetail very nicely for China attracting and supporting international businesses in the telecoms and in other sectors. So in short, there's always going to be data regulation, and new regulations will continuously be issued. And China moves especially quickly in this respect and complexly. But it is very encouraging to see this direction of PRC regulation recently being eased, and it appears aiming to make life at least a little bit easier for international business operations in China.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Dimitri. I agree with you that one on the best approach, in particular when we speak about data privacy, is looking at the broader picture and considering what's happening all over and seeing what other countries are doing in order also to understand why and how a certain country is moving. Of course, there is a big market there, and it's interesting for every country to have a good exchange and easy exchange of data, because of course there is a relevant market and a lot of activities moving forward. We're running out of our time, so I would really like to thank you very much for being with us and for this very clear and quick explanation. Of course, more can be found about this topic on the article that you and the DaHui team have written on the topic that will be linked to this podcast and video. So I would like to thank you and the DaHui team for being with us today, and I very much look forward to meeting you and all our listeners to the next Privacy Espresso. Thanks a lot.